The world looks normal on the surface. Crowded stores, busy streets, holiday noise everywhere. But behind all of that, something is shifting quietly. And today we begin connecting the dots between stories that were never supposed to meet. And by the time you realize how they link together, the truth will already be impossible to ignore. Stay with me, because what starts small today ends very differently than you expect. The streets are packed, and the lights are bright, and everybody is rushing towards something that feels important in the moment, but will likely be forgotten by the end of the night. And that is where today truly begins. Not in a courtroom, not in a studio, not in a headline, but in the noise of distraction. Because distraction is where the biggest stories grow unnoticed. And while people argue over discounts and empty shelves and long checkout lines, a different kind of pressure is quietly building. One that has nothing to do with shopping and everything to do with power, control, and the silent deals people make when they think no one is watching. And this story does not explode all at once. It tightens slowly, it circles, it waits. Because the most unsettling stories are the ones that do not announce themselves. They just appear, one detail at a time, until suddenly everything looks different than it did before. And today that shift becomes impossible to ignore, because behind the scenes of everything familiar, there is a pattern repeating itself. A message posted at the right moment, a statement framed with just enough emotion to shift attention. A wave of reaction that spreads faster than reflection. And once again, the internet does what it always does. It divides not into truth and falsehood, but into belief and disbelief. And that is where the tension lives, because belief does not need proof, just momentum. And momentum is fueled by timing. And this timing is not accidental, because the moment public focus begins to drift, it is pulled sharply back by another revelation, another development, another claim that reframes what people thought they already understood. And suddenly, a narrative that felt settled is back in motion again. Not louder than before, but sharper and more deliberate. And as viewpoints collide, something else becomes clear. The structure underneath the story, the machinery that keeps it alive long after the initial spark has faded. And that machinery is built from influence, from access, from who controls the narrative when the spotlight is on and who controls it when the lights go out. And that is where today quietly turns from observation into implication. Because implication does not accuse, it suggests. It does not shout, it lingers. And once it settles, it becomes difficult to remove. And this is where the audience unknowingly steps into the role, not just as viewers, but as participants. Because every reaction, every share, every comment keeps the loop alive. And what makes this moment different is not the emotion, it is the layering. Because this time, it is not one story unfolding in isolation, it is multiple threads weaving together, each one influencing how the other is interpreted. And the deeper you look, the harder it becomes to separate coincidence from design. And this is where the discomfort begins, because coincidence feels safe, but design implies intent, and intent implies consequence. And consequence is what most people try to avoid, until it becomes unavoidable. And today that avoidance grows thinner, because while one story creates empathy, another creates doubt, and a third changes the rules entirely by shifting attention toward a world where expectations control the flow of everything, where the smallest request carries the weight of authority, and where the quiet decisions shape outcomes far more than the loud ones ever could. And when those details surface, they do not rise as accusations. They emerge as unfamiliar practices, as subtle departures from what is considered normal. And it is in those departures that the tension truly lives. Because normal is predictable, and predictability is comfortable. But departures force questions, and questions threaten stability. And stability is the currency of every system built on reputation. And once stability is questioned, it cannot be restored with statements alone. It requires either transparency or time. And time is the one thing that stories like these never allow. Because time invites memory, and memory invites comparison, and comparison invites judgment. And judgment is where control is finally lost. And so the tug of war begins between those who seek to control and those who seek to understand. And in the middle of all of this, wow,
who want answers and those who want quiet, between those who want clarity and those who benefit from confusion. And as this tension stretches, it begins to expose something else, not just about the individuals involved, but about the environment that allowed it to grow. Because no story like this exists in isolation. It is always supported by a network of incentives, of silence, of risk calculation, of who gains and who stands to lose. And the audience senses this, even if they cannot name it, which is why reactions feel stronger than the surface details alone would justify. Because the reaction is not just to what is visible, it is to what is felt beneath it. And that underlying feeling is uncertainty. And uncertainty is the one thing human attention cannot tolerate for long. It demands resolution, even if that resolution is flawed. And that is what makes this moment so volatile, because the desire for answers is growing faster than the supply of verified information. And into that gap rush speculation, interpretation, assumption, and sometimes projection. And the story stretches and bends under that weight, becoming something larger than the individuals at its center. And this is where narratives begin to harden. Because once enough people agree on a version of events, that version becomes reality, regardless of what evidence eventually surfaces. And that is the danger and the power of moments like this. Because when perception outruns proof, the finish line moves, and accountability becomes harder to reach. And yet at the same time, mechanisms quietly activate behind the scenes. Systems begin to respond. Institutions begin to assess risk. Language becomes careful, and statements become strategic. And that shift alone signals that the story has already crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. Because once strategy replaces spontaneity, the situation has entered a different stage, one where every word is weighed and every silence is calculated. And as that calculation unfolds, the audience begins to sense that the next development will not arrive in the form of a shocking clip or a viral outburst, but as a slow unspooling of details, each one reshaping the picture just enough to keep attention locked in. And that is how stories like this sustain themselves, not through explosion, but through controlled release. And this is only the first release. And already the tension is tightening, because what has surfaced so far is not the conclusion, it is the setup. And every setup exists for a reason: to position the players, to define the angles, to establish the stakes, and most importantly, to make the ending matter. And if the beginning of this chapter feels unsettling, it is because the groundwork is being laid for something far more consequential than what is currently visible. And this is where the real suspense begins, not in what has already happened, but in what is now set in motion and cannot easily be stopped. Them stop noticing, and those outside struggle to prove it exists. And this is exactly where the current tension lives, between what feels true and what can be demonstrated, between what is sensed and what is stated. And as those two drift further apart, the gap between perception and reality becomes the most unpredictable element of the story, because that gap is where loyalty forms, where skepticism grows, and where narratives compete for dominance. and each narrative arrives with its own logic, its own emotional framing, its own version of cause and effect, and the audience is left not with clarity, but with competing certainties. And that is the perfect environment for suspense, because suspense thrives not on answers, but on unresolved contrast. And every new detail that surfaces does not collapse the contrast. It stretches it further by supporting one side while challenging the other. And the result is a tension that never quite releases, because every resolution immediately spawns a counter question. And that is exactly what happens next, as subtle changes in behavior, quiet adjustments in language, and carefully timed statements begin to signal that the stakes have quietly increased. And when stakes rise, restraint follows, because those who sense risk do not move louder, they move slower. And that slowness is often mistaken for calm, when in reality, it is calculation. And calculation is the clearest indicator that the situation has shifted into a phase where every move matters and every misstep carries weight. And as this phase settles in, a new kind of attention emerges, not the fast attention of reaction, but the sustained attention of observation. And that is far more dangerous for anyone hoping a story will simply pass, because reaction fades, but observation remembers. And memory is where patterns are born. And once patterns are recognized, they cannot be unseen, because every future development is measured against what has already occurred. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, a narrative of consistency or inconsistency begins to take shape. And that shape will ultimately determine how the ending is received, regardless of the facts that lead to it, because perception is not built from data alone. It is built from rhythm, from repetition, from the feeling that something aligns or does not align with what came before. And right now, that rhythm feels uneven, because each new development both clarifies and complicates the larger picture at the same time. And that dual effect is what keeps attention locked, because the mind cannot settle when two opposing interpretations feel simultaneously plausible. And into that instability flow new voices, new commentators, new analysts, each bringing their own frameworks, their own biases, their own history with similar stories. And those frameworks act like filters, shaping how facts are absorbed and which conclusions feel natural. And this is where the story begins to diversify, because it no longer belongs to one timeline or one interpretation. It fractures into branches, each one carrying different emotional weight and different expectations for resolution. And the audience moves between these branches, sometimes consciously, sometimes not, pulled by instinct, by identification, by personal experience. And that movement itself becomes part of the narrative, because it reflects not just what is being discussed, but how it is being processed. And that processing reveals as much about the collective mood as it does about the situation at hand. And beneath all of this churn, there is a quieter evolution happening, a shift from curiosity to anticipation. Because once enough pieces are in play, the audience senses that a turning point is approaching, even if they cannot yet define what it will look like. And anticipation is far more gripping than surprise, because surprise is momentary, but anticipation stretches, draws out suspense, and transforms waiting into its own emotional experience. And that is where we are now, suspended between what has been revealed and what has been implied, between what is acknowledged and what remains carefully unspoken. And in that suspended state, every small signal becomes amplified, every hesitation scrutinized, every side comment examined for meaning. And the pressure of that attention begins to shape behavior, because no one acts the same way when they know they're being watched with expectation rather than casual interest. And the difference between those two forms of attention is massive, because casual interest tolerates ambiguity, but expectation demands payoff. And payoff requires consequence. And consequence is what gives meaning to everything that came before. And this is why the current moment feels heavier than the previous ones, because the story is no longer moving sideways. It is moving forward towards something that will define it.
Whether that definition brings closure or further complication remains uncertain, but what is clear is that the phase of casual escalation has ended and the phase of structured response has begun. And once structured response takes hold, timelines narrow, options shrink, and outcomes start to crystallize, even if their final shape is still blurred. And this is the point where many stories pivot from being talked about to being reckoned with. And that shift is subtle but irreversible, because once reckoning begins, the goal is no longer to control perception, but to survive consequence. And the people who recognize that difference early adapt, while those who do not often find themselves reacting too late. And it is in that window between recognition and response that the highest tension lives, because everything is still mobile, still adjustable, still theoretically reversible. And yet the momentum of what has already been set in motion continues to push forward, with or without consent. And that is where we stand now, at the edge of a moment where intention meets impact, where preparation meets exposure, and where the next development will not simply add information, it will change the direction of the entire narrative. And this is only the second stage of that shift, and already the pressure is rising. As everything begins to settle into place, what becomes most striking is not any single detail, but the pattern they form together. A pattern of timing, reaction, influence, and silence that no longer feels accidental the longer it is observed. And this is where the real weight of the story finally lands, because the audience is no longer watching isolated events. They're watching a sequence unfolding with intention. Whether that intention is protective, strategic, defensive, or simply reactive is still unclear, but the result is the same. The story has crossed a threshold where it cannot quietly return to what it once was, and that shift alone changes how everything that came before is now understood, because meaning is not fixed at the moment something happens. It is shaped later by what follows, and what follows now carries more gravity than ever before. What makes this moment so compelling is that it is not just about exposure or explanation, but about responsibility. Because once enough information exists to suggest a larger structure behind the surface actions, the conversation naturally moves toward what should change and who has the power to change it. And those questions are always more difficult than the ones that come before them, because they do not ask what happened, they ask what now. And what now demands choices rather than commentary. And that is the moment where stories stop being entertainment and start becoming mirrors, reflecting back the systems that allowed them to grow in the first place. And yet, even here, uncertainty still holds the reins, because no decisive chapter ever begins with clarity. It begins with tension, with waiting, with the uneasy knowledge that something must give, but no one yet knows exactly how or when. And so the audience remains suspended between what feels inevitable and what still feels possible, between endings that could close the loop and endings that could fracture it further. And that suspended state is not weakness, it is power, because it keeps attention focused and awareness sharpened, and it reminds everyone watching that this story is still being written, even as it is being analyzed. What happens next will not be determined by speculation alone. It will be shaped by actions, decisions, and the willingness or unwillingness to confront what has already been set in motion. And that confrontation rarely arrives in the form people expect. It often comes quietly first, as shifts in language, changes in posture, reassessments behind closed doors before it ever reaches the surface. And when it does finally reach the surface, it rarely looks like resolution. It looks like transformation. And transformation is always uncomfortable because it forces the old narrative to loosen its grip. So as we close this chapter, for now, what remains is not an ending, but a question, not just for the people directly involved, but for everyone watching. How much truth is enough to change direction? How much pressure is required to create accountability? And how long can a story remain suspended before it demands an outcome that can no longer be delayed? And until that outcome arrives, the loop remains open, the tension remains active, and the next development will not simply add to the narrative, it will redefine it. And this is only the second stage of that shift, and already the pressure is rising. As everything begins to settle into place, what becomes most striking is not any single detail, but the pattern they form together. A pattern of timing, reaction, influence, and silence that no longer feels accidental the longer it is observed. And this is where the real weight of the story finally lands, because the audience is no longer watching isolated events. They're watching a sequence unfolding with intention.